All right. Thank you very much. My name is Denise Steckel, and I'm going to just be chatting with you today about clinical collaborations, the why and how, and the insights into managing a combination study. So just to be clear up front, a combination study that I'm talking about is where we're using two drugs in combination. So we're not co-developing them. We're actually providing the patient in a clinical study, basically in the oncology space, two different drugs to treat or see how it works in that particular arm of the trial. So, oh goodness, hold on. I cannot move my slide. Oh, okay, sorry. So the agenda today, so we're going to, why do we do combination studies? So we're going to talk about that. The necessary requirements for combination studies, key factors for success when you work with collaborators, and then just advantages, challenges, and lessons learned on this journey to date. So first off, why do we do combination trials? So it's to identify safe and effective combination therapies. I think this group probably understands that there is a lot of combination work going on in the clinical study field. So this is not new. This is to support cross-indication learnings and identify combinations for priority development. And it's to identify a molecule or mechanism of action that'll work in combination with one of our molecules at Roche Genentech within our portfolio. And so just to restate that collaborator molecules are used in combination to generate signal-seeking data across a wide scope of combination studies. So what are the necessary requirements for combination studies? So please think of this as Genentech Roche is working with a company, and you can think of it simply as that company will provide us their drug. Genentech Roche would run the study, and then we would provide the collaborator with that data from the study to help them understand how their drug worked in combination with the Genentech Roche molecule. So the necessary requirements for this is we have a dedicated team to support the collaborator through the entire process. So this is from initiation of the idea of the collaboration through study closure. So as I'm sure this entire audience here understands, clinical studies, these could be running over multiple years, 2 to 4 or 5 years in our case. So we need to align on requirements for both companies very early. So it's these studies are run globally, so there's impact there in understanding how we can bring in the product and use it in a global setting. Oftentimes, keep in mind that these products we're bringing in are investigational products, so they're not approved yet on the commercial landscape. The other thing we need to understand is the collaborator supply chain, because once we bring it in and put a Roche or Genentech label on it, we are responsible for the study, and then we are responsible for understanding the supply chain. This doesn't mean proprietary information how they make the product. It's talking about where the product is made. Oftentimes these products are made at contract manufacturing organizations. And then we need to discuss and develop a quality path forward. So again, Genentech Roche would be responsible for releasing that product into the clinical study. So how do we have an understanding that the product is appropriate from a GMP compliance perspective and from a regulatory perspective, so that it meets the regulatory requirements for the countries it's going into. So other necessary requirements is really clear communication on study startup, whether that's site activation that people tend to focus on or first patient in. These are longer lead times to get the product in and label it and get it released to the specific countries. So this is really important to have this clarity for everybody involved: regulatory, supply chain, label packaging, the clinical operations folk, um, the study leads, everybody needs to understand this. We need to be aligned on it. And then the other thing that's really important is to remember that the collaborator is not a contract manufacturing organization to Genentech. And this is really an internal lesson we learned. The collaborator doesn't make their product for us, like a contract manufacturer would. And so we don't have input on how they make it, right? So we can't go to them and say, gosh, we're really well versed in understanding how to manufacture monoclonal antibodies. You're manufacturing one, let us give you feedback. It's not about that. Again, it's that relationship of they're providing product, we're going to use it in our combination study, we're going to provide them the data from the study. And it's an interesting discussion to have internally, because oftentimes people do think about collaborators as like co-development partners, which is very different, or contract manufacturers. So key success factors in the collaborator workspace, it's consistent interaction with the collaborator. So again, I mentioned from the idea of the collaboration through study closure, very important to have routine meetings, standard agenda, and like I mentioned in the beginning of this discussion, is we have a dedicated team that facilitates those discussions with internal stakeholders and the collaborator. So we have our team aligned to each collaborator. So one collaborator has one central point of contact within the company, and then that internal person has a responsibility to pull in all the appropriate groups for discussion: safety, legal, supply chain, regulatory, quality, qualified person. They have that accountability. They review critical topics on a consistent basis. So again, at those routine meetings, there is always a discussion about the supply plan, any resupply activities that are happening, material transfer activities, any regulatory changes, which could include manufacturing location changes, testing changes, anything that is going to impact that regulatory filing. Because again, please keep in mind, in these collaboration studies, we are cross-referencing the collaborator's filing. So, because again, we want to be very thoughtful about that proprietary information in the filing. So they're not handing over proprietary information about the product. So we're doing that cross-referencing, and we need to understand if there are any regulatory changes impacting their filings, because then that would directly impact our filing. And then a clear escalation process when events occur that cannot be resolved at the local level. So whether it's supply concerns, as an example, or product changes or challenges, we always need to understand how we're going to be able to escalate to get resolution to the situation at hand. So let's talk about what are the advantages of these clinical collaborations and working through them, and then we'll talk about the challenges, because there's a few of those, and then the lessons learned to date. Because for Genentech Roche, when this group started about 3.5 years ago, this was a bit of a new space for us, generally speaking, where we had a dedicated team. So advantages, we found out very quickly that it was very important to have a dedicated work group to support all the collaborators. You can cause a lot of confusion if you bring in multiple people who maybe don't have the same message to send. And if we're working with a smaller company, it doesn't help us or benefit us for me to bring in 5 or 10 people to a meeting where the collaborator might have 3 people, because it's a smaller company and each person wears multiple hats. We found out very quickly that it was very important to create standard work processes to support the collaborator in the work there. It allowed for a standard approach, both for the collaborator and our internal stakeholders. But please recognize each collaborator is very different. So although we're providing a standard template for information sharing, because there is a significant amount of information being shared, we need to always be open that the collaborator may want to provide it in a different fashion. And that's acceptable as well. But we do start with, here's a standard approach of the information we want. And maybe they give it to us in a couple pieces of information or documents versus one as we have asked. And then the other thing we find to be very advantageous to the team is that internally we have dedicated subject matter experts. So regulatory, supply chain, quality, our QPs, our qualified persons or responsible persons out of Switzerland, we have dedicated people to go to so that we can have a consistent input and consistent messaging and actions. When we first started this, we kind of had everybody we had all the cooks in the kitchen with us, if you would think about it that way. And it really was challenging because everybody had a little bit of a different opinion on how things should go. So it goes back to that standard work process. So what are the challenges we encountered? And there were a few. This is not kind of a straightforward approach to work. So challenges are there's many internal stakeholders, like I just mentioned, with different expectations. So we had to really level set on what that was. Continue to clarify what the difference is about the work the collaboration group does versus our partner and CMO work. So we have partners we co-develop drugs with, and we have contract manufacturers who make some of our products for us. So the collaborators are very different. Again, they're not making the product for us. They give it to us, and then we use it in a study. And that can be reversed as well. We can provide them product. They use it in combination in a study, and they provide us the data. We have many external stakeholders, so many different collaborators to support with different approaches and systems. I'm sure everybody on this call could easily think about, a different company that they're working with, that how they do things is very different from how you would do that internally. Regulatory impacting changes. It always makes me giggle a little bit when we ask a collaborator, any regulatory impacting changes, and they say, well, we're thinking about changing maybe the drug product manufacturer, but that won't take place for another 6 months or so, but we'll let you know. Well, that would be really important to understand as early as possible so that we can kind of tee up our regulatory teams for the changes that are coming, and then have a discussion about any bridging inventory, because again, we do follow or cross-reference their regulatory filings. And then supply issue. We've worked with collaborators where they provided us the supply that we requested, and then they had a shift in some of their clinical trials, and they called us back and said, you know what, we just gave you 1,000 vials, and we'd like 500 of those vials back because we need to support our clinical studies as well. And those are discussions that we take very seriously because we want to be a good partner with our collaborators. So how do we do the review internally to understand how we can provide them their request and make sure that they have success in their clinical trials as well. So that's something to think about. And then the lessons learned on this journey, I think every day we learn a lesson. So I think if you don't learn something in a particular day, you probably weren't paying attention. But here's just a high level on some of the lessons learned I care to share is internal partners or internal stakeholders think of partners in many different ways. So we always need to be clear on this. If we're not, we really find ourselves in a conversation that is much more challenging than we thought, because our internal stakeholders are thinking about this as a co-development or as a contract manufacturer. The clear and open communication is critical from the start of the collaboration, and all the stakeholders explaining the why and just being transparent about what is needed and why it's needed and the timing. Every collaborator is different. I can't state that enough. They think about things differently. They do things differently, and it makes perfect sense. We're very different companies, so we need to be open to that. It's very critical to understand the criteria for managing materials going into the EU, and with the Brexit topic that was, really taking up a lot of our space the last couple of years, just understanding how those studies are going to work. That's very critical when you're talking about global studies and potentially working with companies that maybe haven't had as much experience in the EU and the UK as the Genentech Roche teams have had. And then the lesson learned is the dedicated group will be engaged on many different topics. And you have to be open to learning. When we first started this group, I would have told you that, yes, we're going to learn some things, but we find ourselves routinely talking about tax code, Incoterms, regulatory filing requirements, operations, both from a label pack perspective and also at a clinical operations perspective. Qualified person requirements versus responsible person requirements. So your EU versus your Swiss responsible person versus your quality requirements, your quality assurance requirements, both internal and external, because we do work with external companies to label pack where required. Our alliance management expectations, so we work very closely with our alliance management group, and clinical operations. Those have all been groups where we've had to really kind of dive in and be open to learning, because we do facilitate all of those discussions with the collaborator. Again, keeping that point of contact down to one, and then we bring in the appropriate people to support the discussion. So with that, that is my presentation about high-level clinical collaborations management, and I'm welcome to take and answer any questions that may be out there. Are there any questions for me out there? I think I hear some chatter in the background.
No, we all hear that. I think in a way you illustrate the complexity of working with.
Oh, that's very cool.
Very well.
Sorry.
Okay. I just would love to work with you guys. Okay, because essentially it seems like the perfect environment for a startup to work with pharma.
Yeah, sorry.
With people like you.
Sorry, you're cutting in and out. It's
Well, if there's something that you're interested in exploring with Genentech Roche, you can reach me on LinkedIn. You're welcome to drop me a line and we can have that discussion.
I will reach out to you via LinkedIn.
Perfect, Anton.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, we'll talk tomorrow.
Oops, sorry, guys.
Bye.
Okay. Any other questions out there from the team? If you think of something later, you're welcome to drop me a line on LinkedIn. I will check that, I promise, and get back to you on any topics you may want to pursue further. Or if there's something I haven't covered that you think, gosh, it would be interesting to know, please drop me a line.
So Denise, one question for you about these combinations. I assume that these are all approved for other specific oncology targets, and that now when you do these combination studies, it's to combine an approved medication with another approved medication for a different target in oncology?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So currently, many of our studies have our lead molecule of atezolizumab, or Tecentriq is the commercial name.
Right.
And we're using it in combination. Sometimes it's a commercial drug from another company. Other times it is an IMP, like I had mentioned. However, just for clarification's sake, it doesn't have to be a commercially available product and an IMP. It could be two IMPs that they're looking to understand the mechanism of action of those two working together. So it does not always have to be a commercial product in combination with an IMP or a commercial product. It could be two IMPs. Yeah.
So then who would hold the IND for the combination? Would each company hold the IND for their own compound?
Yep. Yep. It's in really kind of how you could think about it is if there was success in the study, let's assume there's success in the study and both products go to commercial, right? Then the products can reference each other with saying, works in combination for colorectal cancer, first line with atezolizumab and vice versa. So they would be, their labeling would allow for that combination to happen.
Okay, but I'm thinking more of the regulatory background and who's going to hold so the new chemical entity they would hold their own IND, and then in that they'd cross-reference yours for this new indication.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're going to hold ours. They're going to hold theirs. That it goes to that whole cross-referencing that, you know, and when we're doing these clinical studies, it's so important to understand from that regulatory perspective when those changes are happening. But yeah. Yep.
Then I have a related question. So concerning new indications of combinations in terms of intellectual property, essentially, how do you ultimately handle intellectual property arising from new drug combinations for new indications in a way? So old drugs for new indications.
Yeah. So, and I will be transparent about this. It's not necessarily the depth of where my group involves in. However, when we're looking at a combination in a new area, again, each company is going to hold their own IND. So there's not going to be and we work really hard to not, you know, there's that proprietary information, right, in your filing and how you make your drug. And so when we cross-reference, we get bits of the filing that is not